the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, in pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get started with our discussion, please throw us a buck at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We appreciate all the support you guys can give us. And thanks for tuning in today. We are continuing with our third episode on Anti-Oedipus. We are now in chapter 2. We are doing sections 3 through 5, which is pages 68 through, I believe, 105, 106. Yeah, 68 through 106. So we're going to go through the 3 sensibilities today. Coop, how you doing today, brother?
I'm good. I've been listening to new metal all morning, specifically Limp Bizkit's Nookie, to get in the right frame of mind for the libidinal economics of this episode.
This is one of the few fundamental disagreements that we've ever had.
On new metal?
On new metal. That's where we had to go all the way down that fucking list to get to a disagreement. No, I mean, when I was, an adolescent just hitting puberty, Limp Bizkit was like, that was the shit. You could not get away from it.
Yeah.
I mean, in the South, like 4 or 5 years before that, it was Achy Breaky Heart and shit. So right. You just see how musical trends change. But yeah. Limp Bizkit, it's just not my cup of tea. But you've been listening to this particularly because of the new HBO documentary, right?
Yeah, the Woodstock 99 documentary, I think, is a fascinating,
pretty wild.
It's a fascinating study of libidinal economics, and I say that in all seriousness. Honestly.
I know. Yeah,
I'm completely serious. If you want to see desiring production in action, there it is. If you want proof, if you want real proof of desiring production, go watch that documentary. It's all there. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, violence, rape, destruction, etc., revolt, insurrection.
A lot of reactionary investments of the unconscious, one could say. The vibe. I like, however much I don't really like Moby. I thought his description of like, man, I've done so many concerts. I could totally get on a venue like 100 feet away. It's like,
everybody kept saying
those are bad vibes. Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely worth watching. But yes, so the sections we have today are the connective synthesis of production, the disjunctive synthesis of recording, and the conjunctive synthesis of consumption-consummation, which in French is just one word. Which is kind of interesting that they have one word for consumption and consummation, right? Because, one is normally thought of as primarily, eating, and the other is, fucking.
Right.
So
consuming a type of metaphor for a certain cannibalism of the partial objects.
And of the primordial father, right? After murdering him, you sort of incorporate his authoritative parental essence by eating him. And there is there's a little part in here where they do talk about where he brings up the totem and taboo, and I say the crowd of Deleuze and Guattari, they discuss, the primordial father being murdered. And, there's later in Anti-Oedipus, what's really cool is they'll look at Levy Strumoud, who takes up the incest prohibition and the ritual surrounding that in terms of kinship structures. And, Bataille's second volume of The Accursed Share begins with that too. And it is funny though, he's like, I'm going to walk through and break down Levy Strumoud very quickly, but this is boring shit, but there's like a pot of gold at the end of the boring rainbow. One thing I wanted to bring out before we start looking at points, and I know you've got a lot of notes that I would love to go through with you in terms of the way I try to distinguish connection disjunction and conjunction is when Deleuze is working through his version of serialism 3 years earlier in Logic of Sense, he looks at esoteric words, particularly from Carroll. Like, for example, there's the portmanteau word, which combines, there's frumious and chortle and some other words that are portmanteau words. But anyway, Deleuze identifies esoteric words and how they relate to series and their interactions. And so connection is basically succession, right? It's basically and, as they put in the first chapter. And then conjunction for him is coexistence, right? Kind of simultaneity. And then disjunction is the ramification of series, which is the either or. That's just important to note that Deleuze is kind of continuing on and keeping some terminology from Logic of Sense that the translators don't really point out, and neither does Deleuze himself kind of point out. He doesn't quote Logic of Sense or something. He's already moved on. Just thinking about how Deleuze takes some of that terminology and plops it down here. I think it shows a kind of arbitrariness, but there is I think a connection to something that Deleuze is both holding on to and getting rid of, right? In terms of the concept of series interacting is still important, but the kind of philosophy of serialism, or just the working through of serialism, I think that this is another step Deleuze takes forward in the post-structuralism, right? In terms of, because really Logic of Sense is kind of that precipice of
on the verge,
engaging structuralism and sort of going beyond it.
Now, is Logic of Sense your favorite of Deleuze's solo work? Maybe I've heard you say that, or
I find it to be the most enjoyable. One thing that always surprised me, and I've said this at least once before, but I'll say it again really quickly, is how little it seems Deleuze has weight in literature departments.
Right.
That's
true. Yeah.
He has little pockets. He has little
yeah.
pockets that of literature departments that like him. But Derrida maybe was always
true.
And there's a way of applying Derrida that's very concrete. But in terms of Deleuze's interest in literature and his citation, you just look at the Anti-Oedipus we've read till now. Think of all the authors that they cite and work through. So that's why I like Logic of Sense, because not only the form of these series that, as you go throughout, you're going to see a kind of rhizome, you're going to see all these different quote unquote chapters interacting. And there's something then a kind of a prototype for the ideal of the plateau in 1,000 Plateaus, right? And how they are like the rhizomes or like the series kind of interconnecting, and it's not a chronological succession. You don't have to read cover to cover, and they say it should be listened to like a record. Which if you hopefully one day we'll get into 1,000 Plateaus, but it's kind of, there's something to that where sometimes certain plateaus you really come back to try to give you a foothold to look at the rest of the book, because you can kind of pick it up anywhere. And that makes it very frustrating and hard to read, but also enjoyable in a way too. And I think that with Anti-Oedipus, that's definitely different. The mode of writing is on the one hand somewhat more experimental. On the other hand, that's just in certain areas, right? Because obviously on the whole, 1,000 Plateaus is much more. But on the other hand, I do think that it builds slowly, linearly, right?
Yeah.
But they are always kind of looking forward and looking back, right? So when we do focus like we are on little sections at a time to do justice to the whole work, it's good to be kind of trying to think at least back to what we've read, and I'll sometimes point to where this might be leading forward.
Yeah.
Do you want to start with one of your first notes, or maybe something that struck you out of these passages?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of just kind of my experience encountering with the text, and then I thought you set us up beautifully. I don't know if that was intentional. And my first quote that I pulled, that I think there's a very good comparison to, I think, what we do on the podcast that I'll get to, but just a couple of things. First off, that I wanted to say, just going back to your point about Deleuze and literature departments, I just want to mention again, and I've said this multiple times, but I think Proust and Signs from Deleuze is magnificent. And just incredible. I think incredible lit crit. It's beautifully written. It's amazing. So I mean, I'm blown away by that. I was blown away by his prose in that book. So I definitely recommend.
Yeah, and there's
interested and hasn't engaged with it, even if you haven't read Proust necessarily. Right. He does.
That's what I was going to say.
He cites the text. Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing piece of lit crit for sure.
It's incredible the deftness with which he writes about literature, because there are some references in Anti-Oedipus to literature that even in these sections that yes, you would need to read a little bit more, like the Joyce and the Beckett quotes and stuff.
Right.
Like I would need to revisit what Malloy, which I never finished. But on the other hand, like you said, Proust and Signs, it's fascinating how well he writes about literature and extrapolates Proust's kind of philosophical import of thinking, and is able to do so in a way that you don't feel lost in his navigation of the novel.
Yeah. Another thing, the first time around reading this section of the chapter, and this is a function of just the book was written in published in 72. The Oedipus critique is kind of boring a little bit. I think in some ways, first go around, I was kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't feel as relevant now, perhaps because psychoanalysis never took such a hold in America.
That's fair. I mean, yeah. I do think that while it did take hold in certain forms, especially disciples of Anna Freud, and
right,
I do think, the fact has to be that Lacan's celebrity status by this time, which we've talked about too on the podcast, and his just intellectual gigantism. I mean, literally, like he was
the Fred Durst of his time.
I mean, he was such a huge force in intellectual thinking at the time,
right?
But also Sartre kind of popularized a distaste for psychoanalysis. He wrote very heavily against it and makes some good points, even though I think that his kind of rejection of the unconscious, or at least his incorporation of it into a Cartesian framework or a post-Cartesian framework, I kind of err on the side of Freud, but I see what he's doing. But he does have valid points about its conservatism. So, I mean, same with Foucault, right? And his Madison Civilization, or what's it?
Yeah, I was going to ask. I forget the chronology of Foucault's work.
He publishes that in 1961.
Okay.
Right. And so, but Althusser is also dealing with Marx questions, and really does seem like the 60s, especially with structuralism, is trying to grapple with the giants of Freud and Marx. I mean, this is why we've gone from libidinal economy to now Anti-Oedipus, and we're trying to do tandem readings of Symbolic Exchange and Death by Baudrillard, right? This trilogy that we've talked about, I do think that shows the sort of hyper relevance of psychoanalysis in the French tradition that we kind of are lacking in the American.
Yeah.
Except insofar as we've imported Freud and Lacan and other thinkers.
I think it might have been in the Symbolic Exchange and Death episode that I mentioned that, even on our discussion we did a few weeks ago with Todd McGowan, he was, as a Hegel Lacanian, etc. Hegel Lacanian, I don't know what you want terminology, but he was kind of saying that, he's not so much in disagreement about the Oedipus critique specifically. Yes,
in Anti-Oedipus, you mean?
Right.
I do think that it is true that we are the authors themselves say this, Deleuze and Guattari themselves say this, like, we're tired of hearing about castration. We're tired of hearing of all these Oedipal readings, right? I mean, they do start this third section with this kind of implicit critique of all the literary analysts that were so quick to psychoanalyze the author, which is both a very crude means. I mean, it's not even really a literary reading, right? It's this crude, brushing use of Freudian psychoanalysis, and the most, because even Freud's readings of literature are subtler than what they're critiquing. This simple thing where it's like, oh, well, Proust's, his kind of mommy issues and shit like that, like reading, you totally distort the novel and its beauty. And this is why I think they start here with the three syntheses by talking about Proust and how Proust kind of gives us a framework.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is, as a somewhat of a, a student of storytelling for lack of a better word. To me, I think psychoanalysis is an amazing tool for the writer because you can sort of understand. It's very good in terms of developing a framework for this sort of complexity, like a very well-rounded character. The sort of contradictions within the subject is, to me, I think, a very interesting toolbox for a writer who's trying to understand like the sort of psychopolitics of why people behave the way they do and character motivations and arcs and how that sort of develops. I think that's sort of interesting. That's one point. I do want to come back though and say that upon the second reading is when the genius of it, the beauty of it, the libidinal economics really came to fore and made themselves very evident in a way that they hadn't through my first reading. And so I even noticed, in terms of the style of the prose, there are sections, they're not so committed to the sort of artistry as Lyotard is in Libidinal Economy fully, like as far as the aesthetic goes, but you do see sort of flourishes here. And you can even say like, there's a bit, you could probably take sections that we read, you could probably fool me in a blind taste test as to whether that's Lyotard or Deleuze and Guattari.
Some sections you might be confused. I think other sections you'd be like,
Yes.
There's no way Lyotard
Right.
would make a claim that would build an argument. I mean, there is a way in which Lyotard, the labyrinthine, his way of drawing out the labyrinth and its foldings and twistings in the band is much different than, what Deleuze and Guattari find in either in Borges or Borges isn't cited here, but in Logic of Sense, Deleuze is talking about the straight line being the infinite straight line being like the most complex labyrinth. He gets that from Borges, but he works it out in his.
I like that.
Again, literature showing that it has as much worth for Deleuze
Right.
and Guattari as philosophical works. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that, and there's something a little bit schizo about that, right? Freud would probably want, when he goes into a reading of lit, he tries to like not make apologies for like, I'm going to be doing a reading, but kind of, he wants to circumscribe that and say therefore analogously we can extrapolate. Whereas I think with Deleuze and Guattari, it's not about analogy, right? It's that there is something.
Right. It's not about metaphor even.
Right. The art machine is already kind of plugged into the real
Right.
as they
Yeah.
understand it. And it's not about interpreting its meaning, which I think brings us to your first quote.
Very nice. Nicely done. Yeah. I just want to, before we get into the first quote, I just want to mention that I just love that quote from Guattari that is talking about how Joyce, Proust, etc., Beckett, I forget Kafka, he kind of goes on and said, I forget, what was that in? That was in,
That's the first chapter of part 2 of Machinic Unconscious.
and he kind of compares them to, or he almost says like these writers are doing philosophy better than sort of the philosophers. But then he also references Interpretation of Dreams as a great work of literature as well.
That's right. It's a great novel. And he says that In Search of Lost Time is a schizoanalytic monograph as such. So it's not about analyzing. It's not about schizoanalyzing it, right? It already is this work of schizoanalysis, and that it's a false dichotomy to put on one side
Philosophy versus literature.
Guattari's example is science. Like you can't put Newton and Darwin on one side and Proust on the other. Like there's the real and there's fiction.
Yeah.
For him, at least insofar as we are not just concerned with meaning, or we don't see In Search of Lost Time as just this little fantasy world that we escape into.
These are different machines. These are different machines, but they're still within the same, plane of eminence or some shit.
Yeah, or they would say it's the same machine under different regimes, right? They might say something like that, right?
Gotcha.
That's why they say desiring production and social production, right? They're just different regimes.
And then, of course, my joke on that is always that Lyotard's Libidinal Economy is a great work of fiction as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's almost his duty and his honor as a philosopher is maybe what gave him the shame of having to sort of disown it after the fact.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that too.
Right.
The evil book, right? Which is why our Lyotard series is called Wicked Lyotard, just to kind of make the point that we're talking about.
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely. Which I gotta say again, you set us up beautifully for this. I'm very impressed with the way that you did that. That was
it's just all
that was a good
intuition.
forethought, man. That was like that was very impressive.
It's the machine of unconscious.
Right.
Yeah.
This is actually from the end of the section, but I don't know. I thought this would be a good way to jump off into the text because this sort of reminded me of the style of conversation that we have and the type of engagement that we have with these texts. So I'll read here. For reading a text is never a scholarly exercise in search of what is signified, still less a highly textual exercise in search of a signifier. Rather, it is a productive use of the literary machine, a montage of desiring machines, a schizoid exercise that extracts from the text its revolutionary force. The exclamation "so it's" or mediation of igitur on race and an essential relationship with madness.
Yeah, I haven't read Meyer-May's Igitur, and I almost went down that rabbit hole. So I'm going to put that to the side, but we will talk about the racial stuff, which we get in section 5 on the conjunctive. I mean, they say in the next section on the recapitulation of the 3 syntheses that, it's not about meaning, right? It's about production. This is the same polemic that they raised against Freud when he made the unconscious into a classical theater, right? Representing. It's not about representing. It's not about what the unconscious represents. It's about what it produces, right? I think that for them is fundamental to their argument. They're asking, the question posed by desire is not what does it mean, but rather how does it work? I think that's interesting.
And I think one of the the images that stands out from this portion of the chapter is how Oedipus puts this double bind in place.
That's right.
And I think here too, like this is how I saw it. It was almost clamping off the libidinal band at both ends is the image that I got in terms of, and a sort of mix of Lyotard, Deleuze, and Guattari, and what's going on through Oedipus is it's sort of clamping off those flows of desire and trapping them within this. I don't even know how to describe that. Milieu or somewhat, or like this swamp, or I don't know exactly how to phrase that.
They call it an expressive milieu because to stick with the representational, asking what the signifiers are, asking what is signified, asking what it means, is this question about what does the unconscious express? Because, with Freud, so much of psychoanalysis with the talking cure and with just the way the case history works, on the one hand, it's like a detective novel, right? On the other hand, it is this more Bildungsroman, right? This kind of educational novel, this arc of learning that psychoanalysis essentially then one of its parts is about telling stories. And I think that's why Deleuze and Guattari are so keen on making clear that the art machine is also function, because when they say there's not this optimism that psychoanalysis is the only thing, right? But they don't share a pessimism that they don't share that pessimism that sort of moving beyond the Oedipal repressions can't take place within analysis, right? Because Guattari is committed to making the revolutionary machine and the analytic machine kind of work in tandem, work together for new degrees of freedom or whatever you want to call it. And I think that the artistic machine is integral to it too. I think that they could have easily said that in the same breath, in that same sentence, without skipping a beat. Because, I mean, even, you could go, it could be Deleuze's sort of Nietzschean heritage, his alliance with Nietzsche, because, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's first published work, he is asking this question about the justification of existence or life. And he's based or the world, and that the world's justification, if it has one, is an aesthetic one. So this question about the role of art and literature and the literary machine, as they call it, or the art machine, as we could say, they're just different shades. I think that that's important, and that for them, that's the easiest domain to look at to say, how is it working? How is it producing effects?
Now, is that an example of how one of the syntheses function in that way, and in terms of how the discourse of science and the discourse of art or literature sort of interact?
Well, it would be you could say it involves all three, but it would definitely involve this inclusive disjunction.
Right.
Right. In the terms of, Guattari's trying to ask if In Search of Lost Time is a schizoanalytic monograph, and we think of all his fucking crazy diagrams. But if Proust's novel is, as we see here in these sections, it's got obviously a literary and artistic side, but it's got sides that explore the role of consciousness, right? The signs of love. So it's got a hermeneutic machine. It's got a fucking erotic machine. It's got obviously highly charged political machines. We see them talk about Proust incorporating current events like the Dreyfus Affair and anti-Semitism and World War I across this. I mean, it's several thousand pages long, but across the novel, and how the families are sort of immersed in social forces that are animating their desire and aren't just external to it, right? I think that's one of the fundamental things, again, design production and social production being infrastructural. So yeah, I guess that too is what then you would have to say that there's a meta-linguistic statement where, just like Proust's novel, this Anti-Oedipus does encompass some of that disjunctive thing where it's either analytic or revolutionary, or it's just that it's trying to include all those disjunctions,
right,
but also connect them all, right? I mean, it is saying and because it's not necessarily a contradiction, right? I think that's where the interesting thing about how the syntheses are series that affect each other, right?
Right. Yes.
They're not necessarily circular, but this is why the connective the connective subchapter, the connective synthesis part 3 begins immediately with a question of disjunction, with a question of recording. I'm thinking of how when they basically say that the parental or familial use of the synthesis of recording extends into a conjugal use of the connective synthesis. So like they are in interaction. We saw that in chapter 1 too, right? That there is a production of each that's kind of internal, immanent to each, right? They're not just external to each other. So that's where, when you say that Proust novel or Anti-Oedipus are these different machines, and they're mobilized. Specifically, they're mobilized to the front, to the vanguard at certain points when they want to focus on a literary example, but they're never not thinking about the other machines. They're never not like excluding them from the analytic and the revolutionary. So there's not this. That's one of the reasons why it can be frustrating, is so much going on at the same time. But that's part of the also one of its strong points, because it is about this. Our little subject as desire on the body without organs, or whatever you want to call it. Our little, we are trying to, as individuals, but also collectively, like we are now talking about it, we are trying to derive effects that can be the little share of pleasure and enjoyment, but also hopefully enlightenment and sort of catalysts of desiring production that they honestly want us to take something from the work and have it affect us, and not just to ask what they mean all the time. Right. I think this is why, I think Lyotard takes that to the extreme, that this is what we were talking about, right? That he's not asking the question of meaning, right? His book is going to seduce you, betray you. It's going to punch you in the face sometimes. It's going to run away from you. I mean, there's ways that Lyotard, is taking this question of producing effects and not asking the question of meaning even further than I think Deleuze and Guattari, because sometimes they will want to slow down and say, okay, let's think about what the principles of inclusive disjunction is, right? Let's think about the either or. Let's think about the implications for our understanding of how Oedipus is this, this ghastly, monstrous, well, as you said, I mean, they say Oedipus, it's all in the double bind. And you brought that up earlier, right? I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's the question of how what they say, these illegitimate uses of the syntheses, we could say this transcendent conception of the unconscious, as Kant might say, has to be remedied by a materialist and transcendental conception of the unconscious. This is why they turn to Kant and his critique. They don't talk about his 3 critiques here, but they turn to Kant and his method of finding the immanent criteria of finding the transcendental sort of point of view for these things in order to counteract Oedipus, right? In order to counteract the double bind we find ourselves in. And I will say one thing about the double bind is it's interesting that they get this from Bateson, who writes this in the 50s with a couple other doctors. And, he goes on to write Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which is probably his most famous work. And they also get the notion of plateau from Bateson.
Interesting.
In terms of 1,000 plateaus, right? A plateau is sort of a self-vibrating region of intensity that doesn't enter into a climax.
Yeah.
And it does. It's Bateson's working with examples from Balinese culture, where if two young men, say, have a disagreement, instead of their conflict being resolved, is kind of brought to a leader and kept at this height and negotiated in a way that's not about resolving the conflict, but about kind of maintaining it at a certain pitch. I think that's the double bind is definitely something that we can go into if you would like.
I definitely do want to come back to that because I almost feel like maybe some of the double bind stuff is relevant relative to Baudrillard and symbolic exchange and death. But just to put a flag there, I wanted to go back just quickly to mention that I think it's interesting, the scientific machine, the literature, the literary machine, etc., in terms of how these are sort of in the kind of modernist or a modernist schema. These are, you could consider these perhaps phyla, like they're different phyla, right? There are these phyla, and what Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are trying to do is deterritorialize that a little bit and say, because even though maybe the scientific machine is not consciously aware of how it's influenced by the literary machine and vice versa, that circular flow is always in place, whether it be consciously or unconsciously, obviously probably more unconsciously, in the way that those modernity tries to silo off these discourses. There's a disavowal of that reciprocal, I guess that conjunctive or disjunctive synthesis that we talked a little bit about.
To try to make it exclusive and restrictive.
Right. Yes. And then just briefly referencing Bateson and the plateau, it just came to me that plateau sort of is again this sort of topological, I hate to say metaphor, right? Because it's not
they'd want to say figure, but yeah.
But I don't know, I think that's interesting too. Like I hadn't really considered, I don't know why I hadn't considered the plateaus having this topographical significance.
Yeah, and they're sort of, this is why the plateaus are they resonate and ramify like series and like the rhizome, but they resonate together. There's this internal resonance between them. And this is why, the joke is obviously there's I was promised 1,000 plateaus, I got 15. And it's the fact that thinking of each chapter as a self-contained plateau is wrong.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So
that goes to the same thing. Yeah.
So it's, in any case, one of the things that I guess we want to talk about the three syntheses, just the only thing before we look at each or we talk about each and show how they're interrelated in the complex of Oedipus, they want to say that it's all about illegitimate uses.
Mm-hmm.
That's Oedipus is part and parcel with the illegitimate uses of the syntheses.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
And therefore, the illegitimate conceptualization of the unconscious.
That's actually a great example of that idea of these phyla, because Freud is kind of using this mythological literary machine, right?
Yes.
To apply to the synthesizing that with the psychoanalytic machine. Okay. Oh, that's cool.
It's
I feel like I got something there, so that feels.
That's
good.
Yeah. I think that's part of their attack against mythologizing the unconscious, right? Sort of putting Oedipus there so as to find it, because they want to say psychoanalysis didn't invent Oedipus, right? It discovered it to a certain extent. That's what Freud wants to basically say. I mean, you could say Freud discovers it in his own self-analysis, which in and of itself is kind of, for the first time, he notices, hey, that looks like Oedipus, right? That's what they say earlier in the book, because that's kind of questionable because it is about this interesting narcissism, but also self-fulfilling and therefore self-justifying way in which psychoanalysis wavers between these possibilities of revolutionary investments, but seems to either with Freud or with Lacan, but as they say, more so around him, around them, take on these more reactionary ways of confirming the self-evidence of Oedipus as a rite of passage of all humans, right? For all time, in all times.
Yes.
That's what they want. That universalism they want. This is Guattari's disagreement with universals in general, as we've discussed many times.
You must resolve Oedipus, which they reference in the text. I was thinking about, though, this idea of kind of implanting Oedipus to be found reminded me a little bit of I've talked about Memento so much on the podcast, but it really kind of, you remember how like in Memento, he's removing bits and pieces of his file. So it's kind of the opposite effect. But at the same time, though, he is adding new tattoos, etc., right? To find he's adding his own Oedipus to find, right? You know what I mean? He's kind of tricking himself into finding Oedipus in the sense of this killer. You know what I mean? It's this sort of circular, like the Rat Man, right? He creates this unconscious puzzle that he cannot solve, right? Because I don't know, there's a sort of enjoyment in that repetition of frustration, but that's getting into the sort of Lacanian mode of
Well,
analysis.
It's already Freudian, right? Because of beyond the pleasure principle. It's the enjoyment and the repetition that Freud starts to question and has to metaphysically kind of ensconce in the death drive, and also in his vague way of elaborating it, let's say. Almost too precise and too ambiguous at the same time. I mean, it's, the
double bind right there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Guattari would probably say something like that also Oedipus is too abstract and not abstract enough. That's part of his way of, once you diagram Oedipus, which is what we're kind of going into today, as in a Guattarian manner, you start to see not only like what goes into causing it, and we'll get more and more into the cause. There is Oedipus at last. We'll get that in chapter 3, but there's also the effects of Oedipus taken as the model, right? Oedipus, psychoanalysis finds it and reinforces it. This is their problem with how it's running. It's not that the analytic machine is in itself reactionary or has reactionary investments, right? I mean, this is why they also cite Jean Horry, whom Guattari was working with, the institutional analysis that we've talked about,
right?
Injecting social institutions with death drive. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So with the 3 syntheses and the illegitimate uses of them and their undertaking of a transcendental critique, right? I like to call these sections, as I tweeted earlier, the critique of clinical reason. And it's the fact that what they are concerned with are what they call paralogisms, right? And in terms of Greek, it's literally, talking around. It's literally this falsification sophistry in terms of the words para and logos, right? It's this manner of using formulations as a way to kind of box things in that seems logical, right? But is in fact illegitimate, as they say, from the immanent perspective, right? And I think that's the thing that because they say that the illegitimate uses aren't products of the unconscious. I think this is a big thing that they say.
Interesting.
That and therefore
that seems counterintuitive, I think, just as a sort of novice or.
Right. I mean, I think that their argument would be the machinic unconscious or the transcendental unconscious, in fact, doesn't. This is why they've been calling it an atheist orphan unconscious. It doesn't recognize Oedipus. Oedipus is something that is a product of a certain regime of desiring production, but also a certain kind of course we've taken in history, which is why they say that, like, I know they're quoting Andre Green, but he's talking about how Oedipus and castration casts all of history in a new light, recasts it. And this is what they are. They're not denying that, but they are saying that that's just a part of the legacy of these illegitimate uses. So with the Connective, it's they're juxtaposing the Oedipal illegitimate uses of the connective synthesis as specific and global. And really, there's two main takeaways. And I know we want to talk about these, but the first one is basically this question of global persons. I think that I've always found this notion so important for understanding, especially when they get into incest prohibition, right? How, in a certain sense, we sort of, and this is why they have to mobilize proofs in the same breath, right? Because it's this question of the prohibition of incest displacing this desire, but insofar as it displaces desire, it sort of distorts it. This is why, their critique is basically, oh, well, I wanted to fuck my mom and kill my dad. Well, that's just a distorted mirror image as a consequence of the restrictive, it's the specific and global, you create the mother and the father and the my dear little ego out of these illegitimate uses of the synthesis of production, and they are a product of the prohibition, right? The product of don't kill your father, don't fuck your mother, or we could say identify with your father in this sort of conflict, or identify with your mother and therefore fall into the undifferentiated of homosexuality, be excluded, right, from society. They want to juxtapose that with the non-specific and the partial. So it's this battle between the partial objects and their sort of preponderance over the complete object, the detached phallus that rules over the chains of signifiers. And that is, I think, where they are attacking even the role of signifiers and the distribution of lack through castration, which we've also talked about with Lacan often in the past few episodes.
Do you think this is a good passage to read from page 70?
Page 70. Yeah, let's see.
This one here.
Well, I have the number of page 70 circled, so I bet it's going to be a fucking banger.
The opposition here is between two uses of the connective syntheses, a global and specific use, and a partial and non-specific use. In the first, desire at the same time receives a fixed subject, an ego specified according to a given sex, and complete objects defined as global persons. The complexity and the foundations of such an operation appear more distinctly if we consider the mutual reactions between the different syntheses of the unconscious following a given use. It is first of all the synthesis of recording that in effect situates on its surface of inscription within the conditions of Oedipus a definable and differentiable ego in relation to parental images serving as coordinates, mother-father. There we have a triangulation that implies in its essence a constituent prohibition and the conditions, the differentiation between persons, prohibition of incest with the mother, prohibition against taking the father's place. But a strange sort of reasoning leads one to conclude that since it is forbidden, that very thing was desired. In reality, global persons, even the very former persons, do not exist prior to the prohibitions that weigh on them and constitute them, any more than they exist prior to the triangulation into which they enter. Desire receives its first complete objects and is forbidden them at the same time. And I guess that's kind of the double-bind part of it. Therefore, it is indeed the same Oedipal operation that lays the foundations for possibility of its own resolution by way of a differentiation of persons in conformity with the prohibition, as well as the possibility for its own failure or stagnation by following into undifferentiated as the reverse side of differentiation created by the prohibitions, incest by identification with the father, homosexuality by identification with the mother. The personal material transgression does not exist prior to the prohibition any more than does the former persons. And we can follow up with this next text. I'll see what you have to say, if anything, about that section.
Yeah, I mean, it's this interesting thing because they will also say when they're reading Proust that on the one side you have a purely molar statistical side where we are molarly heterosexual, and then we are out of those series, out of that nebulae, as they say, you have a personal homosexuality, whereas the real molecular bubbling forth is a transsexuality. And I think that for them is a way of seeing the Oedipal conflict from beneath instead of from above, because, you know, what is informing Oedipus for us to go through castration and go through this question of either vying with the father or succeeding in quelling our desire to take the father's place, to be the mother's love object, to give the mother a baby, as we've covered. You know, that's how Freud reads it. That we have to go through that. And at the same time, though, I mean, Freud's understanding of bisexuality is there's also this negative side, this undercurrent where we are wanting to be the father's loved object, right? We're wanting to take the place of the mother to a certain extent so we can give the father a baby.
Yeah. A la Schreber, right?
Right. A la Schreber, a la Wolfman.
Well, really, you see Freud doing this Oedipal thing with all of those cases, right?
Yes.
Because I think that's the common thread really between Wolfman, Ratman, and Schreber, right? Is the Freud's diagnosis of the homosexual desire for the father, if I remember correctly. And at least Schreber and Ratman.
I mean, I think that for Freud, the Oedipal conflict also really crystallizes what's going on in the transference between the patient and the doctor, right? His way of treating Ratman and Wolfman, his weapon was to navigate the waters of transference, be able to take on elements of the sort of good father, to work through the double binds that these. Okay, and we'll get to double bind in a second.
Is that the transference element too? The implementation of transference there? In terms of becoming the good father, Freud becoming the good father.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that him taking the father position is a way to, you know, create these mirrors for or to stand in a sort of a controlled manner for the father, so that some of these things can be worked through again. Mm-hmm. Right. Some of these, and this is why he thinks Oedipus is the crystal. It crystallizes just social development, human development, individual ontogenetic development. And I think that he's trying to use, I mean, I think it comes to crown, and he looks back and says, oh, this is what I was doing the whole time. And he's not unaware that he's playing father at times. Right. I mean, like with Ratman it was Ratman, you know, sees Freud's daughter and thinks that Freud is almost like using her as bait, right? Yeah. Because he's got that megalomania that he thinks Freud wants him as the son. I mean, Freud is very aware that they'll say later about psychoanalysis not inventing Oedipus, that patients come already Oedipalized, wanting more Oedipus, can't get enough of it. And, you know, for the Ratman and Wolfman, that's a tool that he wields like a club. Mm-hmm. And I think that he does the same thing to Schreber in his own reading. I mean, they fault him for leaving out all the racial delirium and kind of whitewashing it. He himself forces Schreber into the bind of Flechsig standing in for the father, or God, which he unifies because Schreber already divides it, but God being the father, right? Freud himself is injecting that Oedipal transference into the text, or into his text, in order to read Schreber's text through that lens. It's like, if he would have been my patient, we would have had some father figures to work through, right? That's kind of what he seems to be doing. I was going to go back to the question of global persons, because one of the critiques that Deleuze and Guattari are making is against a certain sort of familialism. You know, and we just talked about how Freud was using one of the vortices to put himself at, right, the father point. And then obviously the patient's playing out the child, the role of the child. And one could say the discourse between them could be some sort of weird mother, or the mother's just absent. In any case, what they are attacking is familialism. Yeah. This is why they take, not to pun on your name, they take issue with Cooper. And say Lang had a little bit better, but he too, in anti-psychiatry, seems to use familialism as a bedrock, right? Mommy, daddy, me, stuff that we've already heard. And when they talk about global persons as sort of coming with the prohibitions, right? It's not until the prohibition that we have father, daddy, or daddy, mommy, me. They want to say that this is part and parcel to Oedipus is part and parcel with this transmission, one could say, of itself, but also of family units, insofar as we understand them in sort of European fashion.
Right.
The nuclear family.
Yeah.
Right. That's why, I have to keep my sister for another man, but take my wife from another father. Right. This question of
interesting.
because this is why they say incest has two prohibitions. It's the negative one, not to take the mother, right? Because she's already occupying her own triangle. You fuck up the triangles if you take the mother. So you have the prohibition of the mother, which imposes differentiation, which means you're starting to butt off into your own triangle. And then the positive prohibition against taking the sister, right? Because you need to exchange her with another family in order to complete their little fucking triangles. So this only functions under the regime of global persons. And, later they'll look at Levy Strumoud and talk about how he goes into this question in depth. And one of the things that is assumed or was assumed that incest is based on generational differences, sort of an ageist differentiation. And Levy Strumoud shows how that's not at all the case.
That's fascinating.
It's not about keeping one generation from marrying above or below. It is much more a logic of the collectivity and the collective's engagement with an outside, which we'll get into. But I love talking about Gilgamesh, instance of Anti-Oedipus, because the tale starts with the townspeople of Uruk, particularly the men. They are pissed. They are pissed that Gilgamesh is fucking
prima noctis, right?
He takes on prima nocta. He's fucking all their wives, and because he's 2/3 God, of course, all their firstborn are going to be his. So, in any case, well, I'll come back to this when we get to chapter 3. But the question of the illegitimate connective synthesis, the global and specific, I think for them is part and parcel of the familialism, and this is why they quote Foucault later, right, saying that Freud continues the psychiatric movement, before him, and just wants to sort of merge the clinic or the asylum inside this familial structure, complete that move. Foucault sees this continuity. And so I was thinking, when we think about, everybody's supposed to, and you complete your own little
erecting the new microphallus of psychoanalysis.
Right. And you complete your triangle by taking on a wife from another father, but then you transmit the new triangle to your child.
Right.
And this is why I was
Oedipus is in the father, we've said too.
Right. This is why the illegitimate use is 3 + 1. The structure is 3 + 1. You need the +1 to which is the transcendent foundation for erecting new triangles. And
so that would that be castration?
I think castration isn't.
It's not a transcendent thing, is it?
Hanging the phallus over the signifying change. Yeah, I mean that they see that as transcendent, but it's with castration, here we're talking about lack. I think with castration, they would want to talk about law. The three paralogisms they're fighting against, or the three boogeymen, which kind of says a lot about Deleuze's affirmationism, is lack, law, and signifier. Those are the three things that will be part and parcel with each of the illegitimate usage. And so with castration, it is about submission to law, right? Social repression sort of in general, but it's connected with the synthesis of connection, which is distributing lack.
Gotcha.
Right? So castration isn't just one of the syntheses.
Right.
And is, I think that the way I think about the familialism and the transmission of triangles is like a virus, right? The 3 + 1, the three angles, three sides of the triangle, the 3 points, but the +1 is the sort of, I guess that would be the next step, is by going through castration and taking on the sort of positive role of heteronormative copulation and procreation, right? I think that by falling under the spell that the pleasure principle attaches to the sexual act and makes parents of us, there's something about that would be the role of castration. And so I think of Oedipus kind of like as a virus, right? Or the familial triangulation that Oedipus entails and is part and parcel with. It is about this transmitting a virus. They say, I take a woman other than my sister in order to constitute the differentiated base of a new triangle whose inverted vertex will be my child, which is called overcoming Oedipus, but reproducing it as well, transmitting it rather than dying all alone, incestuous, homosexual, and a zombie. I mean, it is a kind of viral transmission, and this is also ways of thinking of child as a parasite, but not quite, because animals can, even though it's a kind of symbiotic parasite, right? Because the mother actually gets benefits. Certain mammals get, even though they gain weight, they become faster. So there's some kind of compensation going on where nature's trying to protect its reproducing.
There's some type of surplus, something.
And I think that Oedipus is trying
something is produced.
We could talk about it in terms of Baudrillard, where it is about this code, this Oedipal code, this encoding,
injecting the code
that is trying
the viral code. Yeah.
It's like it's trying to replicate itself.
It's like a botnet or whatever type of kind of, you know what I mean?
And so for them, though, it's kind of the nuclear familial structure of the triangle that is the form in which Oedipus is able to transmit itself so well. As we'll see, they will link Oedipus to colonization. Yeah. And so they kind of want to make it a Western white man virus. Yeah. But we'll get there. We'll get there when we get to chapter 3. Again, that's where a lot of fun stuff goes on. But yeah, I guess that I would just end there with what they are trying to identify as the paralogism in this synthesis of production of the connective synthesis is what they'll call a kind of error of extrapolation. And that error is the extrapolating the despotic signifier, right? The phallic signifier to rule over the distribution of lack, and thereby to kind of make or to complete, if you will, the well-defined boundaries of individual identities, specifically in terms of parents and child, the familial sort of bind that will lead us to understanding the next synthesis, disjunction.
What I think is kind of interesting here is just to think about the way that the family has evolved and along with capitalism and modernity, because of the transition from agrarian society to industrial. The families were typically larger during the agricultural. And I mean, this even goes back, even within the 20th century, right? Early 20th century.
Larger families, especially in agricultural. My grandmother had like 8-9 siblings. My wife's grandfather had, tons. I'm sure most people can say that. So we're not that far removed from it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think, kind of interesting for going back to Freud's time. That's very much still within the Western society. This is very much still the nuclear family as we kind of see it, I think, develops a little bit later once post-World War II.
Yeah.
Or even right around World War II, where industrialization is taking shape and really like
suburbanization.
It's like severing off the extended family, like it's breaking that up into a different social formation. So I just wondered what relevance that has, especially in the way that they kind of map out how Oedipus forms. It's always the 3+1, at least for Freud, or their like critique of Freud. So there has to be like the grandfather involved, or right? Or the when there's a grandparent implicated in as part of that, or am I just not?
Yes, that's specifically, I think the simplest, because in a certain sense, psychoanalysis and in their polemical argument is about neuroticizing and normalizing, and therefore the simplest structure is 3+1. But when they see certain Lacanians and Freudians wanting to deal with psychosis, they see that I asked you this, but I think it's true. I believe it's in the Wolfman's Magic Word where Abraham and Turok basically say that they would learn so much more about the Wolfman if they knew not only about his grandparents, but about his great-grandparents. So there's something for them about psychoanalysis thinking, well, if it's psychosis, that's grandma or grandpa, right? And how then the triangulations are, you're merely extending the trauma of the triangulation back further in order to try to characterize what the psychotic brings that's new and different from the neurotic.
It's more that and less than like trying to almost get to the sort of lost origin that Baudrillard is kind of gesturing in Symbolic Exchange and Death.
There is something similar to that about a certain nostalgia where it's like it's as though individual trauma, if we just go back far enough in the genealogy, and I think they showed that the schizophrenic taken as a model is not, or just schizoanalysis is not trying to find this lost origin, as though if we had a large enough vision and we just trace the triangles back far enough and had all that knowledge, then we would find somewhere the kernel of trauma that gets transmitted. And they're like, no, dummy, the triangles are actually already open. This is why they say it's 4 + n. The idea of a closed macrocosm and microcosm, which is when they turned to Bergson.
Right.
Bergson exploded this kind of truism by arguing for their openness. And I think that they do the same thing with Oedipus and with the familialism, that the child's unconscious is already taking in, and seeing social production infecting the family on all sides, and it's overflowing. So to kind of try to conceptually close the unconscious in on itself in a triangle, double binding it, one could say, right?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's
exactly.
where they see Oedipus as ascendant.
Interesting. I was thinking too that Guattari's little triangle diagrammatic in Machinic Unconscious is it's just such a rich, dense little, it kind of goes towards this whole thing, right? Thing we're working towards. I don't know if you remember that one. You remember that it's the triangle, it's got the partial objects, it's got the little circular like spiral towards the center.
Yeah. And are you talking about the Guattari diagram?
Yes.
Of the different redundancies?
No.
Oh,
it's not that one.
He's mocking Lacan.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can find
the triangle is imaginary, symbolic, real, right? And
basically, yeah.
Those are the three vortices.
It's like binary castrated phallus, except I can't remember the rest.
No, it's fine. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's definitely something we can come back to. But you're right. That's Guattari's kind of parody of RSI, of real, symbolic, imaginary, and they carry on their attack on these terms in here as well. But we keep talking about the double bind, and I guess one of the ways I try to understand the double bind, because for Bateson, he sees it as perhaps too strongly the cause of schizophrenia. And I think that what Deleuze and Guattari are saying, like, no, double bind that's how Oedipus works. So if you want to consider an isolated schizophrenic who's been turned into a sort of clinical entity, then yeah, you could kind of agree that the double bind produces the deadlock that schizophrenics not schizophrenia as a process, right, which they will constantly differentiate. But one of the ways I try to understand the double bind is, you may have known friends like this. I had so many friends growing up who were well off, sometimes upper middle class. Parents either hate each other or were divorced. And a lot of times it would be single children, and they would sometimes have to spend 1 week with one parent and 1 week the other. And so much of the way the child is used as a weapon in that struggle between the mother and the father
as a pawn, sort of.
was mother said, you can't eat candy, or you can't go, you go to bed at a strict time, like, don't listen to her, we'll do it this way. I mean, that kind of way of fighting is a very simple, and it's not the whole of the double bind, but it's a very good example. I mean, double binds also come from one and the same parent, as they give the example of the father who says you can do whatever you want, but it's already implied you'll be punished if you don't do what you know they want or what they've already told you to do. I mean, this is the same double bind the Ratman finds himself in with respect to his father. And we see that the Freudian Lacanian way of looking at psychosis is going back a generation, is that we hear the story. Freud wants to include the story of Ratman's father having a similar prohibition against marrying a certain woman. And so Ratman's father just reproduces the trauma that and the double bind that he was put in.
Interesting.
And this is why they too say that when they talk about
do unto others what has been done unto me.
I mean, that's a good way to put it. They talk about the Rat Man, and I know that they say it later, but the Rat Man, they say, as they're discussing childhood sexuality, they say it didn't take the Rat Man to become an adult for him already to enter into this differentiation of the rich woman and the servant girl, right? And to fetishize them and have weird phobias of prostitutes, et cetera, right? So like he's already, as a child, primed. And this is why they question the latency period and how that's this uber explanatory concept. But I am getting ahead of myself. That's just one form of the double bind that I think, as we see divorce becoming more and more popular, at least in America, you'll see it not just happening with the one parent, but kind of, as I said, there's a tug of war going on right between mother and father. And it's this question of either which I'm going to identify with, right, in terms of what we already talked about, right, or in the sense of which one is supposed to have priority, or knowing that potentially doing what one parent wants while you're with that parent, you might be punished when you go back to the other parent. So having these conflicts of having these kind of contradictions, Bateson works through how a lot of this is both conceptual and linguistic, how the schizo will turn to metaphor in order to navigate these double binds, precisely because the literal is closed off, and I think that that's why they also say, in terms of Proust's work, but also just in general, they want to say that there are no contradictions, there are degrees of humor, right? And so, this is why in Bateson's essay on the double bind, he turns to jokes as one source of navigating the double bind. But
Can you elaborate on that? I think I'm
I mean, to a certain extent, it's like the joke sets up expectations of a certain logic of how it runs,
mm-hmm.
and then upsets that logic.
Okay, gotcha.
Right?
Okay,
I mean, it's very similar to how Freud talks about the joke lifting repression.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of how.
It.
Yeah, because I think this is very much so. Like, of course, I love, one of my favorite forms of humor is the non sequitur, but it's even at its one of its most simplest forms is you're just taking the unexpected conjunction of words, right, that produces a surprise. Yeah, I don't know. There's even at that level, like there's a certain way that exemplifies this logic of walking you down a certain line of logic and then reversing that at the end. And that surprise moment is where the humor is to be found or claimed. It's almost this extracting this surplus jouissance, in a sense, if you would allow me.
I think you're totally right. And so for them, one of the ways they understand double bind is how psychoanalysis is able to reinforce Oedipus and turn, again, this universal logic that this is what we all have to go through. There's then kind of an internalization of Oedipus that is projected back out and found everywhere, including in social authority, and it leads us to become docile subjects, right? Or at least reinforces that. This is how psychic repression and social repression reinforce one another and are part and parcel. I think that when they say double bind is the second paralogism of psychoanalysis, it's none other than the whole of Oedipus. I'm not sure what a good word for it is, but yeah, it is this question of, as they say, they relate it down to the three, I think they call it familial complexes, but you have phobia where you're either parent or child, or you have no way of knowing whether you're parent or child. You have hysteria, whether you are man or woman, and then you have the obsessional who doesn't know if he's alive or dead, right? And they want to show, especially through Schreber, this is where they come back to Schreber, when they come back to Schreber at certain great points, but they kind of show how all three of these disjunctions are shown to be inclusive, right? That you're trans, alive, dead, transparent, child, transsexual. It's this question about not always being at the same time, but it being this non-decomposable distance that you traverse, right? Schreber himself, as they say, he gives birth to humanity. He gives birth to humanity and can finally die, right? Like this question of the schizo being able to sort of, or the inclusive side of disjunction. What do they call it? It's positive inclusive disjunction. This question of gliding along traversing what seem to be contraries, but no longer are, except in the illegitimate use, right? Where we have to sort of take a stand on being man or woman, being parent, child, being dead or alive, right? Those are somehow exclusive. I think for Schreber, and we see with delirium, that is in no way the case.
Where do you think we should go from here? I did have, I think getting into the bisexuality and the transsexuality rather was kind of interesting. I know we wanted to talk about that. You did mention Schreber too. There's a very interesting quote about him being like a spore case that was inflated.
Yes.
Because I think we've done
releasing.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about recording. We've talked about some of the syntheses. We've talked about the formation, the 3+1, the 4+N. We haven't talked about kind of the racial elements, the Hitler stuff,
well,
with the Nazis, etc.
I mean, yeah, we should spend the rest of our time on the conjunctive synthesis of consummation-consumption.
Okay,
that's the longest section in these three, and they do come back to Schreber. I see on page 85. The first things to be distributed on the body without organs are races, cultures, and their gods. The fact has often been overlooked that the schizo indeed participates in history. He hallucinates and raves universal history and proliferates the races. All delirium is racial, which does not necessarily mean racist. Now, we constantly have to come back to Schreber throughout the book, especially in these early parts. But
yeah,
the point that they are making is how much Freud, as I said, whitewashes all of this racial delirium of Schreber. And I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, there's a sense in which Schreber initially, insofar as he is investing the Germans as the chosen people, the Germans, the preferred elementary language of God as a kind of proto-German, and this question of the Aryans and their future. I think that his delirium does start off racist in the segregational usage, the segregative sort of transcendent usage. And yet they show that he kind of breaks through the white wall. He begins to rave that he's a Mongol prince, right? He breaks through the Aryan racist use, and at least is, if not totally like free of all racism, is at least sort of raving in a way that is not, and it's not about being the chosen people. I think that this is one of the things that I love about this section, is this notion that Oedipus depends on the nationalistic, racist, sort of we are the chosen people feeling, and not the other way around. It doesn't produce it, it's an effect of it.
I wonder too, I think private property comes into play here with these familial triangles because, right, it's all about ensuring that your sort of lineage or whatever is preserved, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of
So
like only in the context of a private of where private property exists does it make sense for there to even be, like, only within that framework does the idea of the nuclear family even have any kind of, does it make sense? Without that, what's the point of a surname? You know what I mean?
Well,
It's like
it's
the imposition of the family on the fucking assemblages of enunciation or the desiring machines, or
yeah, it's the
it's
creation.
closing them off. Yes, from the connective synthesis.
Yeah, you create these global persons, you create these stable identities and exclusive entities, and then you found them upon this, as you said, this question of transmitting my name. It's a form of narcissism that we've talked
Yes,
about in
right.
it's this question of, and it's the same with Gilgamesh too, right? He wants to remake Uruk in his own image. It is a kind of fascist way of doing things. And yeah, I think that's the question. It's the 13 words, right? About securing the future for the chosen race, for my, which happens to be my race, right? Which happens to be the one that I belong to. And this is where they talk about the segregative use of the third synthesis, the synthesis of consumption, which, as we saw for them, the synthesis of conjunction, right? The conjunctive synthesis of consumption, I'll get it right, is about, it's the movement of what they call voluptas, right? Voluptuousness, the enjoyment that passes along to me, my little share. That's the third synthesis. That's my little bit of enjoyment that I as a subject get. And I think that for them, this is a fundamental questioning of the like self-identity of the ego and the sort of self-identification too with any sort of, again, this question of the chosen race, the chosen people, the ones sort of ordained to take on the future. I mean, Straber himself has this kind of boiling in him too when he wants to recreate humanity, or when he feels he's becoming woman to procreate with God, to recreate humanity. There is a sense of that it is about sort of narcissistically reproducing myself and wanting the best for those like me. And this is the way that it is about belonging. It is about belonging to a closed group. And we talked about with Todd McGowan, I mentioned about one of the things I found fascinating in Badiou's ethics is this question that there's no full event. There's no event that's for only some subjects. That's the fascist conceptualization of certain events that are, that there is like world destiny inscribed, inscribing my people, those like me, the events just for me, not for you, right? And that type of segregation they see as the third paralogism, this third transcendent use of the syntheses.
I think this quote from page 86 kind of goes to this too, because and kind of the way that it applies this to scientific, I don't know, discoveries, but labels perhaps. It is a question of something quite different, identifying races, cultures, and gods with the fields of intensity on the body without organs, identifying personages with states that fill these fields, and with effects that fulgurate within and traverse these fields. Whence the role of names, with a magic all their own. There is no ego that identifies with races, peoples, and persons in a theater of representation, but proper names that identify races, peoples, and persons with regions, thresholds, or effects in a production of intensive quantities. The theory of proper names should not be conceived of in terms of representation. It refers instead to the class of effects that are not a mere dependence on causes, but the occupation of a domain and the operation of a system of signs. This can clearly be seen in physics, where proper names designate such effects within fields of potentials. The Joule effect, the Seebeck effect, the Kelvin effect. History is like physics, a Joan of Arc effect, a Heliogabalus effect, all the names of history, and not the name of the Father. I especially find this little bit about how the role of names and them having a magic all their own being pretty interesting little phrase.
Yeah, the role of proper names.
which goes to my argumentation or point about surnames and how that only has resonance within a system of private property, of exclusivity.
Yes.
Of exclusivity to, I guess, I don't know what that would be, what that exclusivity is towards.
It's also the ego in its own, right? I mean, you would know better than this, but Stirner, I mean, it's this question. I think that for Deleuze and Guattari in this schizophrenizing way, they call into question the proprietariness and the possessiveness of the self and its self-identity, its stability, this question of its openness or of its fundamentally split nature.
Yeah.
This swarming with larvae, as Deleuze will sometimes talk about the eye.
Really, honestly, for Stirner, something like Oedipus would be considered a spook, especially in the way that Deleuze and Guattari's criticism, their sort of line of critique, falls within that same argumentation. It's something that's imposed externally. It's not transcendental property, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about...
But maybe I misunderstood your Stirnerian.
No. I'm just thinking about how with the conjunctive synthesis, I find it fascinating thinking about the Odyssey and Odysseus's journey to get back home, his 20-year journey after, because obviously the Iliad is this magnificent story about the destruction of a certain culture, right? And so it begins with the fundamental conflict of races, of cultures and gods, right? I mean, it is literally swarming with gods. And in Odysseus, he's worried about what constitutes genuine, authoritative, authentic Ithacan rulership, right? Which is the line of Odysseus, but somehow he's cursed with only having one child. I mean, even if he could get back, let's just say Penelope probably couldn't have another child. But in any case, he's already got the one child. That child is why the drama hinges on Telemachus, who is under threat by the suitors who want to kill him because he's kind of in league with his mother to bide for time. And the suitors are the sort of the barbarians at the gates, right? We're trying to destroy the sovereignty of Odysseus, and Odysseus himself has to lose his proper name in order to get back home. It's this sin of hubris in shouting out his name that gets him punished, right? That gets him punished for his misdeeds. So he has to lose his name and come back in disguise, only to obviously regain it at the end, because it's supposedly got a happy ending if we think about it from the point of view of Odysseus and his family and the Greeks, instead of from the point of view of the Trojans or the suitors who were slaughtered at the end. I think of Odysseus as exemplifying some of this stuff about there's an inherent racialism, but the Greek conflict with Troy isn't really animated by racism, right? I mean, they are described in fairly glowing terms, and we see that Agamemnon's really thinking about plunder and prestige that goes along with that, and it's only through goading Menelaus, his brother, the king of the Spartans, into he needs him, but he goads him into it with Helen of Troy, betraying him. So it's got an edible kernel to it too, to a certain extent, right? The cuckoldry and whatnot. Yes. But it's not about this question of we are the superior race, we will defeat the Trojans. I mean, they figure out pretty quickly that they perhaps aren't superior, right? I mean, it's Odysseus's magnificent idea, his craftiness with the Trojan horse that gets the victory. There's this kind of betraying a certain unwritten rule of like honorable warfare. Virgil will get into this too when he wants to say the Romans are honorable and they send their legions out and they face you and you're facing the Romans, whereas the Greeks, they're crafty little fucks. Yeah. They do guerrilla warfare and they,
what's funny is there's a quote in the movie The Rock from Nicolas Cage's character is like, I don't trust the Greeks even when they come bearing gifts or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're the they're the liars, and you could say that that's also why there's a sense in which they're all punished everything goes wrong for everybody that goes back. Odysseus is the one after much suffering because he is the worldly guy. He gets to experience all the inexperienceable. He gets to experience the limits of human participation in the extraordinary. But everybody else has a bad time coming home, right? Agamemnon's stabbed. He's been cuckolded, ironically. Menelaus got Helen back, but they can't. He's cursed. They can't have a child, right? So his lineage dies. Everybody gets fucked over. So it's not like the Greeks are the superior race. They're punished very, very strongly for this. And I think there's something to read into that. The fact that Odysseus is somehow in the end the one lucky one is
it's almost
ironic.
As if
it's ironic to a certain extent.
It's almost as if Oedipus is the Trojan horse, right? We're talking about Baudrillard as far as code being injected, the viral nature of that.
Right. It's hard to say, right? Because I think that for Deleuze Guattari, we'll see, it is a way of conceiving of social relations. It's a way of conceiving of modern alienation into familial groups, right? It's the sort of natural progression of patriarchy. As we saw them quote Kant, who turns to Roman law to define marriage as the ownership of another person's genitals. It's that kind of progression of Western thinking that leads to you see in ancient cultures or quote unquote primitive cultures how children are raised in common.
It takes a village.
Yeah, Pierre Plaster talks about how in I think it's the Gyaki or it might be the Guarani. One of the tribes he's looking at, there's like a 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 male to female ratio. So how do they naturally solve this by the woman being able to take on multiple husbands? And the husbands begrudgingly accept this because that keeps the sort of social harmony in equilibrium. Right?
You know what's interesting about that, I think, is the rise of polyamory and how cyclical that is, right? Because I think right around the turn, or at least, apocryphally, perhaps I should put this in quotes or denote this, is that in the 70s is when the kind of whole swinging thing became sort of a deal. And I don't think that's by accident in terms of the socioeconomics going at the time with the advent of the neoliberal period. And now you see the same thing, I think over the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years perhaps, this is coming back. Polyamory is definitely on the rise in terms of the popular imagination and so forth. You see this a lot more, like having been on dating apps over the years.
Gotcha, yeah.
Around 2014, 15, you never saw that. Now it's like, 30% of people are like, oh yeah, I'm polyamorous, blah, 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 on their profiles and such, which I don't think is a coincidence.
There's something to it. I mean, we could also say that the decrease in home ownership, leads to smaller or larger groups of people who may or may not be
right. Yeah,
married, living together. So do you want to say a few other things before we wrap up?
I mean, there was a couple of really, I thought, very interesting bits about Schreber. Another interesting part is we didn't talk about anything about the egg and the schizo and their relationship.
I didn't want to delve into that just yet, but
gotcha.
But I mean, I guess, do you mean to read it's the top of 84. It's the beginning of that 5th section. They say, in the 3rd synthesis, the conjunctive synthesis of consumption, we have seen how the body without organs was in fact an egg, crisscrossed with axes, banded with zones, localized with areas and fields, measured off by gradients, traversed by potentials, marked by thresholds. In this sense, we believe in a biochemistry of schizophrenia in conjunction with the biochemistry of drugs that will be progressively more capable of determining the nature of this egg and the distribution of field gradient threshold. You mentioned a little bit with the proper name stuff about, and with the way that the first thing to be distributed on the body without organs are races, peoples. It's a question of these different regions of intensity for the unconscious, I think, for them. And And I guess that what, when they talk about the egg in A Thousand Plateaus, when they come back to it, how does one make oneself a body without organs? They're basically talking about, and they're following Rouillet, who discusses this, but I'm sure Deleuze is picking a little bit from Simondon, who doesn't himself talk about the egg, but you can apply it just as much as theories of individuation, where they talk about how the egg undergoes these torsions and twistings and foldings that no individuated being could undertake without tearing itself apart.
The libidinal band overheating.
Right. And so I think that that's what I would say about it's in the segregative use, the illegitimate use of the third synthesis, of the conjunctive synthesis. It is this question of focusing on the already individuated ego that somehow is like Kant's subject. It's the self same I that attaches to every thought representation, to every cognition. And I think that for Deleuze and Guattari and post-structuralism and blah, 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 it's this question of the ego that is constantly in this realm of becoming, in this becoming mad, one could say, this mad becoming. And it's not stable, it's metastable. And, it's this question of, I think for Deleuze and Guattari, they want to say that one of the stereotypes I think they would fight against would be this stereotype of you're progressive when you're young and then you become more conservative as you get older. I think that kind of stereotype is a question of the natural, as a biological image, a biological metaphor of how animals, beings, living beings age, right? And as they age, they lose more and more of the potential energy for individuation. And that's just a natural function. But I think that for them, that is a separate question. That's a question that's separate from the legitimate uses of the syntheses, design, production, And so I guess, that would be part of where I would go about the egg, because we'll hear more about it, but
Gotcha.
But I think that main thing about the fact that it can undergo these transformations that no individuated being can perform. I think that's one of the reasons why body without organs has to be understood in that sense of these intensive regions, these non-decomposable multiplicities that can't change dimension without, you can't take parts away or add parts without changing their dimensions. And it's also a way of thinking about, well, I was going to talk about Spinoza, but because I do think that he's getting some of this egg stuff from.
It does kind of like it has a certain monistic. It has a certain monistic element, right? Because of the infinite potential, right? And I think also part of that is the phrase you always bring up, the polymorphous perversity, right?
Yes.
Of the egg. It's like the primordial. I mean, you could even think of this as some type of a singularity, like in terms of the universe, right? There's infinite potential in that singularity.
Yeah, I mean, Freud hits it on the head when he talks about the polymorphous perversity of the infant, right? That it hasn't developed a consciousness yet. It hasn't developed an unconscious. It's just different bands and different zones, different bands of intensity of autoerotic
mouth, anus, etc.
It's a mass. Yeah, and so I think that what they are trying to articulate is kind of one could say the polymorphous perversity of sort of our participation in design production, and it's I try to think about it. Sometimes it's just like there is a sense in a very like straightforward, commonsensical way. I'll just say there is a sense of Deleuze and Guattari forcing us as readers to be open-minded about these things. And I mean that in a very broad sense, because there is a sense in which there's a closed-mindedness. You call it the double bind if you want. There's like a closed-mindedness to these illegitimate uses of the unconscious that somehow seem to accord with and are in harmony with the status quo, with the state of things as they are, with investing into these reactionary structures like the struggle we've talked about over the funding of police, right? One could say, right? The question of Blue Lives Matter and all of these things, this question of finding this question of open-mindedness is about being self-critical, about bringing our own Oedipus to the stage of its self-criticism, and recognizing our fascist tendencies, recognizing that we have this habit, of this is my little body, I've got my little bubble around me, and I've got my little circle of friends, I've got my ways of seeing the world, and things that throw that into confusion or things that call that into question, we naturally have these defensive mechanisms that we bring in. And some of that's kind of what I mean about being open-minded is this question of sort of opening ourselves up
to possibility, potentialities.
Yeah. And to not, I guess it's like not ignoring and repressing the innocence of madness, right? As Proust, I think McGowan quoted Anti-Oedipus when they quote Proust saying, "What bothers us is madness and its innocence." Isn't that what he says? This is a great quote. I want to read it. "More than vice," says Proust, "it is madness and its innocence that disturbs us." So I guess that's kind of the thing, is that we are all fundamentally alienated, self-alienating personages, and we try to keep all our shit together and function in this kind of fucked up world order, in various regimes of locality, of localness, of micro-political little regions. And sometimes that can cause us to take ourselves too seriously, right? And cause us to think that the world needs more me. when really I am not self-identical to myself. I think that's how they try to blow up the segregative use of this question of, I found my group, and of course my group has the right way. You can see in the history of religion, the question of schisms in Christianity, for example. It's always these breaks that you're never breaking away from a church and saying, we don't really have it right, and we're not the correct one, but you guys can hang out with us if you want. It's never like that. It's always like, we have the fucking truth. This is the way to read the Bible. This is what the revealed word is. This is how you should live. This is the dogma. I think that a lot of that they are calling into question here is what has sedimented as psychoanalytic dogma. And Lacan, too, is trying to do a bulldozer, especially in the early seminars. You see him calling out his critics, or not his critics. You see him calling out his adversaries very clearly, where he's like something. I mean, they said it in the first two parts of chapter 2, where Freud at the end of his life is sensing that something's wrong, something's gone wrong in analysis, and he can't put his finger quite on it. I think that Lacan, too, is trying to say that the future of analysis has to take a new path. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to, in that sense, move forward in the spirit of Lacan, even when they criticize him and those around him.
Yeah. Definitely want to mention this before we wrap up, would be that this discussion here, and this is kind of along the same lines, is that, and I forget if they characterize it as an investment, but they give the dichotomy of a revolutionary like a consciously revolutionary movement or whatever. Investment. Okay. So it was investment. So this consciously revolutionary investment can, on the flip side, have this fascist or reactionary unconscious investment. And that the reverse can also be true. However, it's a lot more difficult for there to be what did they say? It's harder for there to be a consciously reactionary investment that is unconsciously revolutionary. I
believe that's what they say. I'm trying to look for it, because we will get, especially in chapter 4, we will see much more of this interest in investment dialectic work out, right? They are kind of asking, it's the same question in a different form. How does desire come to desire its own repression? How do individuals come to invest consciously, unconsciously in areas that conflict with their interests, specifically, you can say their class interests, however you want to call it. I mean, we talked about racism, but this is obviously, we know in politics how racism can work on the I would definitely wouldn't want to call the Democratic Party the revolutionary side and the Republican the reactionary side. Let's not really do that. But we see how class solidarity gets fractured through the lens of pitting heteronormativity against alternate sexualities,
Right. Yeah.
pitting races against one another.
Exactly. Yes.
That kind of, that's, I think, part of, and I think it does come, this is kind of why they talk about these different syntheses and the problems they pose, the effects they have. That's kind of what leads to this way in which we invest in reactionary forms that totally ignore our interests, and therefore we actively desire our repression, or what doesn't coincide with our interest. It's page 105. They say, hence the goal of schizoanalysis, to analyze the specific nature of the libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject who desire can be made to desire its own repression, whence the role of the death instinct in the circuit connecting desire to the social sphere, which we talked about in episode 1. All this happens not in ideology, but well beneath it. An unconscious investment of a fascist or reactionary type can exist alongside a conscious revolutionary investment. Inversely, it can happen rarely that a revolutionary investment on the level of desire coexists with a reactionary investment conforming to a conscious interest.
That's the exact passage I was referring to. I kind of want to get personal a little bit in the sense of, and this is very much influenced by, like, it's going to sound corny or cringe, but having watched that Woodstock 99 documentary, because, this was, I was in the summer of 99, I was 16 years old. And so at this point in my life, this is almost, so I feel like I have a sort of almost conscious evolution of dissolving Oedipus in a sense, having been raised, fundamentalist Christian, right? There is this element of racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. Like all of these things, there's a certain wholeness, there's a feeling of completeness or unity, this almost lost innocence, if you will, of the polymorphously perverse. But as I've gotten older, I've at least consciously tried to explode those things, dissociate myself consciously from this Oedipal kind of situation. But at the same time, the danger in that is that that still doesn't address the unconscious reactionary elements that can exist even within that conscious framework, trying to, I guess, embrace multiplicity, embrace difference, etc.
Yeah, it's, with the example of Woodstock 99, we saw that the field had changed, not just from the 30 years prior to the first Woodstock, but even from 5 years prior.
I mean,
right?
Even getting into, for one thing, the original Woodstock was not this idyllic thing that they made it out to be to begin with.
That became a narrative. That became a story. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Which goes to, that kind of would sort of go into Baudrillard and simulation and simulacra, which we'll get into in a few weeks as well. Sort of how that, right? That's a good example of how simulation occurs.
I think that one of the things that I like that they brought out but didn't necessarily always hit is this question of how Y2K was a kind of a mass hysteria.
Yes.
And it was formulated as a potentially real problem that would have effects, but there was this feeling of this quasi-apocalyptic feeling of just burn it all down. Right. I mean, literally, like, the Y2K was this eruption of a death drive that sort of took over, if you want to try to describe the mass hysteria.
Yeah. And
I think that wasn't the cause, but that was a catalyst for all these white boys, right? The white boy summer of Woodstock 99.
Yeah. And the kind of molar milieu of it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that kind of anarchism that isn't concerned about the future and is trying to take this break, if you will, from the, fuck the authority or whatever, but it's really a manner of satisfying themselves, because you heard from many of them when they're breaking shit, when they're tearing stuff down, when they don't give a fuck, it's not necessarily that the end of the world's coming. That's not what they say. They say, we're fucking bored.
For me, what was most stark about some of there was a normal guy, and he was talking about how he participated. I mean, at least by appearances, a normal, average-looking guy that participated in the rioting and so forth, but he felt a certain sense of community as part of that, which I thought that being one of the most fascinating little nuggets of that whole thing. And that's why I think that the libidinal economics of that whole thing are so fascinating. The way that you're seeing desire production manifest itself, it's all there. I don't know. That's the last thing I'll say about it.
No, I mean, I do think that's interesting when you talk about the quote unquote normal guy who's finding the sense of community, this belonging.
I mean, it's like after the sacking of a city, right? It's kind of the same.
You didn't see, you saw some people, some bystanders being like, well, that's just stupid. But you didn't necessarily see an active group trying to stop them.
Right.
You didn't see groups coalescing in opposition. It was more of a passive, well, fuck it.
Yeah.
So, but, in any case, yeah, I think that this question of, because the question of I am of the superior race, this question of the segregative use of Oedipus, this illegitimate use whereby we invest in the dominant class against our interests, we see this in the apology about capitalism, where we're all temporarily inconvenienced millionaires.
Yeah.
And that sort of we'll get our little silver lining, we'll get our mansion down the road as long as we become good capitalist subjects.
I feel like that's a good stopping point.
Yeah, honestly, what's nice about this is we'll come back to these syntheses next episode, because the very next section is on the recapitulation of the syntheses. So we'll get to go deeper into them and see the implications of the transcendental unconscious, the transcendental and materialist unconscious as they formulate it.
Nice. There's a couple of passages about simulation here that we'll pick up. I say we just we'll incorporate those into Symbolic Exchange in Death, Chapter 2.
Yep.
I've already made preparations for that. And then I think, so next week we're going to look at Mouse is the Gift, or at least that's the plan.
That is the plan. Yeah.
But this will be Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour signing off for the week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.